Obviously, one of the most distinctive features when it comes to the Holy Thursday liturgy is the period of adoration, which immediately follows after the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. And even though there's technically kind of like no wrong way to do adoration, at the same time, I want to give you a certain perspective on the practice of adoration, which you might find kind of helpful, regardless of whether or not it's Holy Thursday. So to kind of frame the issue, I want to talk about this really famous story from the Gospel of Luke chapter 10, the story of Martha and Mary. So as a matter of background, Jesus Christ loves everybody, right? But at the same time, Martha, Mary, their brother Lazarus, they're basically his best friends, right? And so this is where Jesus spends his days off, if you will. And so in the context of this particular story, what you find is that Martha is in the kitchen making food, and Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet. But then all of a sudden, Martha is mad. And so basically, just to kind of paraphrase, what she says is, Lord, don't you care? Don't you care that my sister is basically doing nothing, sitting at your feet? You should basically command my sister to help me in the kitchen. Now, obviously, you know what comes next, right? Jesus is going to correct Martha in some way. But at the same time, before we get to that, I want to kind of highlight a common misunderstanding when it comes to this story. And so I think a lot of times people simply remember this story as highlighting the importance of the contemplative life over and above the active life. And so it would seem to be that the simple takeaway message is contemplative life good, active life bad. Which in a certain sense is right, in a sense that doing is supposed to flow from being, and in particular a certain kind of being with the Lord. But at the same time, this point can be misunderstood to mean that it's downplaying the importance of the active life. And so, for example, throughout history, throughout Christendom, we can imagine all sorts of situations where people have actively lived out the spirit of love and charity to the benefit of other people. So there's that. And on top of that, to simply say that I have faith or charity without works, without the active life, is simply a contradiction. And so given all that, what is the gospel ultimately getting at? Well, before we get to what Jesus actually says, perhaps I might kind of frame the issue by giving you an analogy. And so, for example, let's say you're hosting a party for a bunch of friends, and so it's kind of a large party which requires many hands, mindful of the fact that many hands make less work, right? And so, obviously, there will be certain people working in the kitchen, but other people working in the living room, kind of hosting and entertaining the guests who are present. If you've ever hosted a party before, you know that sometimes that's just how things go, right? And so even though sometimes you might prefer to be hosting the guest in the living room, sometimes, a lot of times, you just have to be in the kitchen and be happy doing so. And it doesn't take too much of a stretch to imagine a situation where you actually are happy to be in the kitchen, to not see it as a sense of slavery or being forced or relegated to the kitchen, but the sense of, okay, we're part of a team, and my role and task in terms of making this team go, at least right now, is to be in the kitchen preparing the food for the guests. And that's a long way of saying that even though Martha, in the context of the gospel, blames her circumstance, the kitchen, her sister, even Christ himself, for her irksome temperament, the reality is that one thing doesn't necessarily lead to the other. And so again, one can imagine a situation where one is happily working in the kitchen for the sake of the party, for the sake of the guests. And of course, Christ flags this, right? And so what he says is, Martha, Martha, you are worried and anxious about many things. In other words, the problem is not so much me or your sister or even the work which you're doing. There's a certain disorder in your heart where your spirit is dissipated. Again, you are worried and anxious about many things. And then, of course, in contrast, he proposes the remedy. Your sister Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken away from her. And of course, in saying this, the Lord is referring to the fact that Mary is not simply sitting at his feet. He's also referring to the fact that Mary has a listening heart, a receptive heart, a receptive disposition. And so given all that, the exhortation is kind of interesting, is not so much to simply say our prayers or maintain a habit of prayer, but instead it's all about one's interior disposition. It's all about one's interior life. Do we have, again, an open heart, a listening heart, a receptive heart? And more to the point, do I live a life which is compartmentalized? Or in fact, do I live a life which is constantly in relationship with the Lord, where I do things not simply for the Lord, but always with the Lord at all times and everything? The example that comes to mind, as you know, one of our recurring events that we have here in the context of the parish is Theology on Tap, so this theology talk given at a local pub. And I remember during a recent session of Theology on Tap, a question came up with regards to prayer. And so basically the question was, what if you find that you're really busy and you find that you don't really have a lot of time for prayer? What should you do? And one person said, well, basically if you're busy with other things, then you're busy with other things. And so you can cut down your prayer. You don't even have to go to church, which was obviously wrong. But then someone else said, well, basically what I do is that I front load my day. And so I say my prayers at the beginning, and then once the prayers are done, I get on with the rest of my day. And I will suggest to you that answer is also wrong. And that might sound kind of surprising, but the reason why both those answers are actually massively fundamentally incorrect is because it betrays a lack of integrity. And so the goal is to not simply give God what he wants in terms of prayer and sacrifice and then get on with the rest of my life. The goal is to live with the Lord, to abide in the Lord, to share in his blessed life. Because at the end of the day, that's meant to be the source of my purpose and direction, never mind the source of my joy. Again, to share in God's blessed life all the time, in a way which is not deferred, in a way which is not compartmentalized. Now, practically speaking, what does this mean, especially when it comes to adoration? Well, think of it like this. There's obviously your public life and your private life. And so your public life is obviously who you portray yourself to be when you're out in public, out in the workplace, out with people that you don't know or people you know casually. Whereas in contrast, your private life is meant to be who you are behind closed doors, with your family, with your friends, people who are close to you. I would suggest, though, when it comes to your relationship with the Lord, there's meant to be a third dimension, your hidden life. So who you are when it's just you and the Lord, away from the public, but also even away from your closest family and friends. Who am I when I'm before the one before whom there is no deceit, the one who counts every hair on my head, the one before whom there is no secrets, and again, no room for deception or lies? Who am I in that case? And see, the point I'm trying to get at here, friends, is that when you're before the Lord in a stance of prayer, but especially when you find yourself in the sacramental presence of the crucified Christ, as in the case of Eucharistic Adoration, you're meant to present to the Lord your hidden self. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting, right? Because a lot of times what we'll do to avoid that particular dynamic is distract ourselves, certainly, but in particular distract ourselves with many things, not unlike St. Martha. And so what we'll often do is we'll bring before the Lord our issues, our problems, our concerns, and rationalize our distractions by saying, well, look, I'm trying to process with the Lord. It's not to say the Lord doesn't call us at times to do precisely that, but if you think about it, if you pray into it, and you kind of situate everything in God's call, you'll realize that in the vast majority of cases, he does not. He does not call you to worry or fret in front of him, but instead he calls you to simply be with him. To be with him, again, as you are, no more and no less. But there lies the great gamble when it comes to adoration, right? Do I trust that that's good enough? Do I trust that the Lord knows that I have concerns and problems and deadlines and all sorts of issues in that regard? And more to the point, do I trust and do I believe with all my heart that if I focus on being with the Lord, especially again in a stance of prayer, with the ultimate goal of becoming like the Lord, that everything else will be taken care of? Everything will be fine because I've focused on being as opposed to doing. One final example, just to kind of illustrate the point. So as I'm recording this, I still haven't really formally met Archbishop Francis Cardinal Leo, who of course is the Archbishop of Toronto. I met him once in an elevator and in passing in the context of a hallway, but beyond that, we haven't really had much of a formal conversation. But at the same time, I gotta say that when I see Archbishop Leo from afar, what really strikes me is that he's a man of prayer. Certainly I've seen him pray, but what's most convincing to me is how he carries himself. And so here's a man who truly understands being as opposed to doing. And this really came through in the context of a priest seminar that was hosted by the Archdiocese of Toronto that was held at Nanawasaga Inn in Alliston, Ontario. And so basically in the context of the priest seminar hosted again by the Archdiocese of Toronto, the various priests in the Archdiocese gathered together to learn about a particular topic, whether we're talking about evangelization, preaching, Catholic education, or whatever the case may be. Anyways, what always happens at the end of the seminar is that the Archbishop of Toronto gives a brief talk to the assembled priests, giving sort of a State of the Union address, if you will. And it's kind of funny, but the thing that I remember when it came to this last seminar was the thing that Archbishop Leo said at the very beginning of the talk. And so I'm not going to do justice to it, but basically what he said was like, look, brothers, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I just want to say thank you. I know the people of God, they thank you all the time. They'll say, nice homily, Father. Sometimes they actually mean it. But truly, I want to say to you, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for everything you do, for me, for the Archdiocese, for the people. Thank you, and we can't thank you enough. Now, again, I gotta apologize. That's not exactly what he said. That's kind of a loose paraphrase based on my kind of vague recollection of what he said. But the thing I want to press upon you again is that the way he said it was just so captivating and so compelling that everyone was spellbound. Everyone just hung on to his every word, even though all he was saying in a certain sense was thank you. And again, this was all more impressive because he was speaking to priests who are really sensitive to cliche. And in a certain sense, what is more cliche than simply saying to someone else, thank you? But you see, here's the thing. The thing that wasn't cliche was his heart, the attitude that he brought to the table. And the whole point is that you can't bring that level of sincerity and authenticity to the table. You can't exude the presence of God without having this stance of receptivity, this stance of listening, this habit of prayer where you focus on being with the Lord as opposed to simply saying prayers. But again, therein lies a great gamble when it comes to the gospel. If you focus on simply being with the Lord, He will change the person that you are. And because that person is different, the world will be different. And may God bless you all.